Morning, everyone. It's April 1st, April Fool's Day. Happy month of April. Couple announcements today. A very, very brief lecture, brief activity for you today. So as you see the agenda here, just so you know, on Schoology, I put some important dates in the upcoming bar, so you should be able to see that. That's going to be your chapter summary. It was due on Friday. That's going to be shared with me. The response to the question, the activity I gave you yesterday on the Red Scare, that's due to turn it in. And there's been a number of people asking questions about the 40 and the 20 questions. That's still April 14th, so we haven't changed that date as well. So, couple things. I'm scheduling a Zoom meeting. You should be getting an email response on that sometime today for Monday at 10:30. That's primarily to discuss the exam format. I want to practice with Zoom because the way I see this is that with the 40 and the 20 questions, you will be presenting to the group. I'll be running the slide. You would have shared it with me already. So I want to just get some practice with that. One reminder is we've been told that you should have your cameras off on Zoom. I can have my camera on, but you should have your cameras off. So please do that before you log in. The other thing that I want to implement, I know many of you have been doing it, is I have to have some way of kind of checking your work, sort of daily stuff. And I thought a very easy way to do that would be to establish my own Albert class. So I did that yesterday. You see the enrollment code there. Even if you have a regular account with Albert, you're going to join my class. It's called A Push. And from time to time, I'm going to have some Albert questions as a check-in, as a practice. We still have to do the grade thing. Will that facilitate maybe the final exam? I'm thinking probably. So if we could get that taken care of by the end of the week would be great. So I'll be checking that daily. One of the things that I would like to do is do these little lessons and then have some sort of easy check for you, check for understanding, whatever that may be. And I think the easiest way to do it is Albert. My AP classroom is a mess, so I don't particularly like that. So again, if you have questions regarding that, please let me know. I'm just going to talk very briefly about JFK and Eisenhower foreign policy this morning. One very, very short practice question you can take a look at. You don't have to respond to anything. And I do have a number of links, two of which I really want you to watch regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then, as we're talking about JFK, if you have time, there's always about the conspiracy about his assassination. So, some couple of very good videos that, if you're bored and you have some time, I have the links for that on the document. So, let me pull this over and we'll look at JFK and Eisenhower's foreign policy. So we see a shift in American foreign policy from Truman and Eisenhower. We talked about on Monday the containment set up by George Kennan. Well, we have a new director of, not a director of foreign policy, but a new Secretary of State, a guy named John Foster Dulles, who Winston Churchill once called Dulles, which is a pretty good line. And we have a different viewpoint on the Cold War. So we know some key aspects of containment was, of course, the Marshall Plan, economic relief, the Truman Doctrine, the supporting of Greece and Turkey in containing Soviet expansion. Talked about the Berlin airlift for sure. Creation of NATO started in 1949. We talked a little bit about the National Security Council, 68, this idea of this permanency of the American military establishment. And we also have the beginning of the Korean War in 1950 as a example of containment. Dulles and Eisenhower took a little bit different tact. Although they still supported NATO, they also started signing what we call mutual security agreements with individual countries. But the biggest difference would be, and this ties in with the concept of brinkmanship, is this idea of massive retaliation. Dulles said that the United States has this advantage in nuclear weapons. And he said to the Soviets basically that if you attack a NATO member, if you are expanding, we're not just going to go to war, we are going to destroy you. We are going to send all of our atomic weapons to you and wipe you off the face of the earth. So it's a what we call massive, or it's sometimes called MAD, mutually assured destruction. And the logic behind it is that no one would be crazy enough to do that. So therefore, peace is going to be maintained. So this was sort of, this was the term brinkmanship is pushing the envelope right to the brink of war and then pulling back. So there was an increase in tension really in the 1950s related to nuclear war. We also see the beginning of what was called the domino theory. A lot of textbooks and stuff will talk about the domino theory in the context of Korea. Domino theory for American history is really about Vietnam. So the idea of one country becomes communist, the next and the next and the next, like a row of dominoes. So in your mind, Vietnam is really the example of domino theory. We also see an expansion in CIA and covert operations throughout the 1950s under Eisenhower. One of the most infamous ones is the coup that was led by the CIA that overthrew the government of Iran and established a guy named the Shah of Iran. And that's going to come back and have some consequences in the late 1970s when the Shah is overthrown by the Iranian people. So he was put into power by the CIA, primarily to get their oil. And the last one would be the Eisenhower Doctrine. And the Eisenhower Doctrine is really critical, not so much, as we live today, but throughout the 1970s and 80s when the Eisenhower Doctrine said this, that basically the Middle East was a fundamental importance for the United States. The United States had a role in the Middle East. The United States had interests in the Middle East. And a lot of that comes to the support of Israel, but primarily, again, the supply of oil. Lastly, we see this thing called dollar diplomacy. Part two, we remember William Howard Taft had the original dollar diplomacy. And this is where we see American businesses acting in somewhat of a economic imperialism, going to other countries to establish business ties, again, in the Middle East. That was really critical. But in Latin America as well, and the U.S. government supporting that. Cuba was particularly invested heavily in by American businesses in the Middle East and Central America. But in oil companies, primarily in the Middle East, were really important in this sort of dollar diplomacy. Now, just some examples of going back to this massive retaliation and mutually assured destruction. This picture on the upper left, you've probably seen something like this. This is a bomb shelter. People in the 1950s built bomb shelters because they feared the Soviet threat of nuclear war. If we were in class, I would have we do some other things, but we just don't have the time to do it. Regarding the devastation of nuclear weapons. Anyway, I might put that link on the document for you. Take a look at it. This other picture I just find is fascinating. This is, oops, sorry. This is, if you look in the background here, this right where my cursor is, that is the Wisconsin Gas Company building, which is still around. This is in Milwaukee. And this is what is called a Nike missile. A Nike missile was an anti-aircraft missile. So this missile establishment was basically on the site of what is now Summerfest. And approximately this is where the Marcus Amphitheater is. So when we talk about the Cold War being this distant, long ago thing, yeah, it was a long time ago, but it affected Milwaukee. So Milwaukee felt that they were important enough to be targeted by the Soviet Union, and the federal government established these Nike missile sites. There were sites here right on the lakefront, on the north side of Milwaukee around Capitol Drive, and then there was a Nike missile site out in Muskego. So it was real to those people. We don't really need to, I'm not really going to spend a whole lot of time. I'm running out going through this, but this will be recorded. So these were key events. The coup in Iran, I mentioned the Suez Crisis in '56, creation of the Organization of American States, Guatemala, Puerto Rico. Eisenhower ended the Korean War. The French depart Indochina. We'll get into this, the setting up of the Geneva Accords. And then America's role taking that over. When we look at JFK, JFK too was what we refer to as a Cold Warrior, just like Eisenhower was. He, however, he was like more of a crisis manager, basically. He screwed up, and he admitted it, with the Bay of Pigs, the so-called invasion of Cuba. But the real crisis and the real highlight, as it were, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is what I really want you to watch on the link. It's called The Cuban Missile Crisis. It's again from the perspective of Robert McNamara. As a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that tells the story pretty well. We begin the first steps towards this period, which is later known as détente, but an easing of tensions. And the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to ban nuclear tests in the atmosphere. We also see JFK's establishment of the Peace Corps, something that's still around today. And we also see JFK continuing America's involvement in Vietnam by increasing the number of troops into Vietnam. So there's some question about if Kennedy had lived, would we have been in Vietnam? That's debatable. But there were plans, so-called plans, to try to get out of Vietnam. But we'll talk about Vietnam later. So that's all I have for today. Please note, as you see here, there's a question, just one multiple choice question comparing Eisenhower and Kennedy, and this is Eisenhower's famous military-industrial complex. Couple links. The ones that for sure I want you to watch are the Cuban Missile Crisis and the meeting with Castro. That's from The Fog of War. These next two are totally enrichment. If you're bored, one's called Oswald's Ghost, that covers all of the conspiracy theories. And the other one is The Cold Case, which kind of forensically disproves all the conspiracy theories. So take a look at them as your leisure. Those are just your assignments for today. So talk to you again tomorrow.